Now to talk more about the latest tariffs, let's bring in now live Isaac Cohen. He is the president and CEO of Inverway, LLC, which is a Western Hemisphere business development company. Thanks so much for coming in.
My pleasure.
Isaac, let's start with this. What should we make of the fact that Beijing's retaliation is tariffs and not a promise, for example, to deny market access, that the U.S. action here has been 10% tariffs in the short term, not 25%? Could it, in fact, have been worse?
Well, yes, it could always be worse. But I think the most important thing right now is that focus is beginning to move towards the WTO, which is the institution that is in charge of administering the rules of international trade. Now, if we can channel this dispute to the WTO, perhaps we may end up with a positive result in the sense that the organization will be strengthened as a result of that.
Do you think that's possible, though, given the kinds of statements we've heard from this administration? We should do away with the WTO. We don't need to be part of the WTO. And then there's also the faction that simply wants reforms. But we don't know who's going to win out here.
Yes, that's true. But it is also true that the United States has complained in the WTO about China. And China has complained about the United States in the WTO. So they're sort of meeting. There's a meeting of interest there, I think. The thing is, how are we going to do this? I think the whole thing should start by a standstill.
What do you mean by that?
Standstill means that nobody is going to introduce more tariffs.
How do you get there?
Well, that should be the prerequisite to negotiate, because otherwise it's not credible. You sit at the table, but you're putting more tariffs, on the side. So I think the first step is to have a standstill.
Let's move to consumers for a moment here. I know that you're very familiar with everything going on in the Western Hemisphere where it's concerned with consumers. I guess I wonder if, or rather because the tariffs aren't going up until after the holiday shopping season is over, and yet we don't really know what the impact is going to be on consumers, therefore, in the short term, because we don't really know exactly how much the markup's going to be for the vendor. But we also have this threat of the $267 billion worth of tariffs going into effect as soon as the White House doesn't get what it wants. What do you believe that consumers should be thinking about, planning for in the short and long term?
Well, tariffs are taxes, and taxes are going to go up, and that means that prices are going up. So consumers should expect inflation and paying more for any kind of product that they shop for. So the first consequence is an increase in prices, which is going to hurt everybody, consumers. And do
you think Americans are going to feel it short term?
Absolutely. I think we're already feeling some of it, in the sense that steel and aluminum are already having an influence over overall prices. So that's only the beginning, and we're gonna be hurt in our pocketbooks as consumers.
One of the stated objectives, or either obviously or not so obviously by this administration, about what they're trying to accomplish with these tariffs is to get companies to move their production back to the United States. With the knowledge that you have in the Western Hemisphere, have you seen any evidence that major companies or manufacturing organizations are moving production either back to the United States or at a minimum back to North America?
Well, that's very complicated, because one of the reasons why these companies have gone abroad to produce is because salaries and costs in the United States are too high. And consequently, the only way they can become competitive is if they move to countries where they can pay reasonable salaries. And you have a problem there. I don't think these companies are going to come back. You're going to have to give them a lot of incentives in order for them to come back.
What about to Mexico? I've been reading today that there may be some companies who would just come back through Mexico and depending on what happens with NAFTA, be able to be part of the North American market in that sense.
That can happen. I mean, going to Mexico is a fairly reasonable way of investing, but the issue is that the United States is also pressuring Mexico in order to increase the utilization of components from the U.S., which are more expensive. Parts for automobiles in the United States are more expensive than anywhere else in the world. So if you ask Mexican companies to use parts produced in the U.S., well, you're going to have cars that are more expensive.
We don't really have a clear end game in sight. We just see every tariff response by China elicits another tariff response by the United States, and back and forth we go. So given that, what do you believe the prospects are of talks? We know that President Trump basically asked President Xi in his statement when he released the tariffs yesterday, hey, let's sit down and do this together. Maybe we can do something that the lower level people can't. But it's really hard to come to the table, as you point out, when you've got more tariffs over your head. That doesn't make you look like a strong person in the negotiation. So what's your take on the prospect of talks even at that level?
It's not credible. As long as you have these tariffs going on, conversations are not going to be credible. Because you are talking at the table and suddenly you have more tariffs. It's something that is contradictory in that sense. So this is what I say. First of all, let's have a standstill in order to be credible that you want to negotiate. And if you really want to strengthen the world international trading system, go to the WTO, because that's where you have taken your complaints. Mm-hmm. Not only you, China, not only you, the United States. Both of you are already there. Sit down and negotiate, but be credible by agreeing on a standstill.
All right, you heard it here. Isaac Cohen, thanks so much for coming in. We appreciate your time.
My pleasure.